Most people believe they already know how the Weimar Republic fell apart. Germany lost the First World War. The Treaty of Versailles buried the country under crushing debt. The currency turned into scrap paper overnight, and into that chaos strode Adolf Hitler, seizing power almost by default. It's a clean narrative, an easy one to repeat, and it is, in nearly every important respect, incomplete. Not because the individual facts are false. Each piece of that summary happened, but compressing it into a single cause and effect chain hides what actually explains something far stranger: how one of the most educated, industrially advanced, artistically brilliant societies on Earth surrendered its government to a fascist movement in barely a decade and a half. The tidy version makes the collapse feel inevitable, as though the outcome was locked in the moment the ink dried in 1919. That is not what happened. What actually happened is far more unsettling, because at every stage there were identifiable people, in identifiable rooms, choosing paths they were not forced to choose, choices that, stacked across 14 years, explain how a democracy dies, not in one dramatic instant, but through a slow accumulation of betrayals, bad bets, and institutional cowardice. So let's rebuild the story properly, starting with the chapter almost nobody talks about, the moment the war actually ended. When the armistice was signed in November of 1918, the German public reacted with something closer to disorientation than grief. For the entire war, the German High Command had fed its citizens a steady diet of censored victories and manufactured optimism. As far as most Germans understood, their armies were still advancing, and no enemy soldier had set foot on German soil in the West. Sons and husbands had died by the hundreds of thousands. Families had survived on rationed bread and boiled turnips, and the payoff, they were told, was coming. And then, almost without warning, word came down that it was over, and Germany had lost. Picture what that does to a nation's sense of reality. You've been assured for years that sacrifice was buying victory, then told the war is finished and you were on the losing side the whole time. The explanation offered to the public, pushed out before the armistice paperwork was even finalized, wasn't that Germany's armies had been outmatched, or that strategy had failed, or that the war became unwinnable once American troops entered the fight. Instead, the explanation was betrayal from within. The army had been stabbed in the back. This is the origin of the Dolchstoßlegende, the stab in the back myth, and most retellings treat it as a footnote, background propaganda to the Nazi rise. That undersells what it actually was. This was a calculated maneuver executed by the two most powerful men in the German military, Erich Ludendorff and Paul von Hindenburg, engineered specifically to delegitimize democratic government before it had even been formed. Here is how the maneuver worked. By September of 1918, Ludendorff understood the war was lost. Germany's last major offensive had exhausted its reserves. American forces were arriving at over 200,000 troops a month, and the front was buckling. Rather than accept responsibility, he and Hindenburg executed a piece of cold political strategy. Instead of negotiating the surrender themselves, they insisted civilian politicians, many from moderate and left-leaning parties, request the armistice. The generals who had run the war handed the burden of ending it to the very people who would soon build a new republic. Then, before parliamentary investigators, these same generals testified that the army had not been defeated on the battlefield at all. It had been betrayed at home by socialists, communists, and supposed traitors within German society. The men who had actually presided over military failure walked away unscathed, while the new democratic government inherited both the humiliation of losing and the impossible bill for having supposedly caused it. This wasn't a natural byproduct of losing a war. It was a manufactured weapon, deployed to ensure any democracy following the Kaiser would be branded illegitimate from day one. And it worked. The Weimar Republic was born carrying not just economic hardship, but a permanent question mark over its own legitimacy, one it would never fully shed. The Republic's founders were branded traitors by a public that had spent years being deceived about why the war was actually lost. Now let's move to the Treaty of Versailles, because this is where the popular telling reaches its loudest and most misleading section. Yes, the treaty was harsh. Article 231, the so-called War Guilt Clause, forced Germany to formally accept sole blame for starting the conflict, a claim most historians today regard as a gross oversimplification. The reparations bill was staggering, calculated by Allied commissions at roughly 132 billion gold marks. Germany surrendered around 13% of its pre-war territory. The Rhineland was demilitarized, the army was capped at 100,000 troops, and the coal-rich Saar region came under international administration. This was, without question, a punishing settlement. But here's what the popular narrative consistently gets wrong. It treats Versailles as an automatic death sentence for German democracy. That claim doesn't survive scrutiny. Plenty of nations have absorbed brutal peace settlements and survived. France, after the Napoleonic Wars, rebuilt its political order despite enormous indemnities. And Japan, after the Second World War, lost its empire and was occupied by a foreign power, yet still emerged as a functioning democracy. Versailles was a heavy burden, but it was not, by itself, a guaranteed death warrant. What made it lethal was how it got used inside German politics. The real damage of Versailles wasn't contained in its clauses. It was how effectively those clauses became a rallying point for every anti-democratic faction in the country. Nationalists used the treaty to paint the Republic as illegitimate. The far right used it to stoke revenge fantasies and racial scapegoating. Even moderate politicians who wanted to negotiate reasonably with the Allies found that cooperation on reparations or borders was instantly branded as collusion with the enemy. The treaty created a climate where compromise looked like treason. And here's a detail most retellings skip. The reparations burden, enormous on paper, was repeatedly renegotiated and reduced over the following years, and Germany ultimately paid far less than the headline number suggested. But the political damage was already locked in. The belief that Germany was being strangled by an impossible debt became the defining myth of the Republic, regardless of what the actual ledgers showed. Now, let's talk about money, because this is the part of the Weimar story everyone thinks they understand, and almost nobody actually does. 1923, the year Germany's currency essentially died. Citizens hauling wheelbarrows of banknotes just to buy bread, children stacking bundles of worthless cash like toy blocks. By October of 1923, the monthly inflation rate had reached nearly 30,000%, with prices doubling roughly every 4 days. The central bank was printing the largest banknote denomination in recorded history, 100 trillion marks. By late November, a single American dollar was worth over 4 trillion German marks. Why did this happen? The common explanation is that Germany printed money simply to cover war debts. There's a kernel of truth in that, but the real mechanism is more complicated and more damning. The roots stretched back to the war itself. When fighting began in 1914, Germany abandoned the gold standard, letting the government print freely to fund the war effort on the assumption that a quick victory would let it pay everything back with reparations extracted from the losing side. That assumption collapsed along with the war effort, leaving Germany with enormous internal debt and a bloated, unbacked money supply. But the simplistic version misses something crucial. The hyperinflation did not detonate immediately after the war ended. It took years to reach its catastrophic peak, and the trigger that pushed it over the edge was a concrete crisis. In January of 1923, French and Belgian troops occupied the Ruhr, Germany's industrial core, after Berlin fell behind on payments. Chancellor Wilhelm Kuno called for passive resistance, and workers across the Ruhr walked off the job. Here's the decision that turned a serious crisis into an outright catastrophe. The government promised to keep paying the wages of roughly 2 million striking workers and printed staggering sums of money to fund that promise. The central bank monetized government debt at a runaway pace. By April 1923, 3/4 of all treasury bills issued were being bought using freshly printed currency. And by September, most of those funds were going straight toward financing the Ruhr resistance. The head of the Reichsbank at the time was not corrupt, and he wasn't unintelligent. He was something arguably more dangerous, a competent official operating inside a broken framework, genuinely convinced his institution's duty was to supply whatever currency the economy demanded. By late October 1923, the bank announced it had used over 2,000 printing presses across dozens of paper mills to produce marks worth well over 100 trillion, and was disappointed demand had outpaced even that. The spiral was finally broken in November of 1923 through brutal austerity, a new currency backed by mortgaged industrial, an agricultural land, and a complete overhaul of monetary policy. The exchange rate stabilized, the immediate crisis ended, but its effects didn't, and this is the part most histories rush past too quickly. The hyperinflation of 1923 didn't just wipe out the value of the currency, it wiped out the life savings of an entire social class. Ordinary, cautious people who had spent decades investing in government bonds and building pensions woke up one morning to discover their savings were worth less than the paper they were printed on. Insurance policies maintained faithfully for 30 years suddenly couldn't buy a loaf of bread. Think about what that does to a society's foundation. The people who had the most invested in order and stability, usually the bedrock supporting any democracy, had just been financially annihilated. Their faith in institutions, in currency, and the entire premise that playing by the rules pays off was shattered. Picture the retired railway clerk in Hamburg, 40 years of loyal state service behind him, who had put his pension savings into government bonds because he trusted his government, only to find that his entire life's accumulation couldn't purchase a cup of coffee. Picture the widow in Munich, her husband killed on the Western Front, collecting a modest military pension that evaporated to nothing within weeks. These weren't reckless people. They were the exact citizens who had done everything society told them to do, and the system destroyed them regardless. Meanwhile, Those holding tangible assets, real estate, factories, foreign currency, sailed through the crisis largely unscathed, and some even profited handsomely, as debts denominated in marks vanished along with the currency's value. The hyperinflation didn't merely destroy wealth, it redistributed it visibly and violently from the careful and the honest to the well-positioned and the opportunistic. The middle class noticed the game had been rigged against exactly the people who had played it fairly, and that wound never really closed. When the next great crisis arrived, those same citizens were no longer willing to give the existing order another chance. They had already learned, in the most painful way imaginable, that the system could not be trusted. And when someone eventually offered a different kind of order, brutal and authoritarian, but order nonetheless, a significant portion of them were ready to listen. Here is where the narrative takes a turn most tellings handle poorly, because after the currency crisis was finally tamed, something genuinely impressive happened. Germany stabilized. The years between 1924 and 1929 are often called Weimar's Golden Era, and there's real substance behind that label. Under the diplomatic skill of Gustav Stresemann, first as Chancellor and later as Foreign Minister, Germany was welcomed back into the international community. The Dawes Plan of 1924 restructured the reparations schedule, eased the immediate burden, and, critically, opened the door to a flood of American capital. Between 1924 and 1929, tens of billions of dollars in foreign investment poured into Germany, most of it American loans. New factories rose, assembly lines modernized, industrial output doubled. Germany reclaimed its position as the second largest industrial economy on the planet, trailing only the United States. By 1929, German industrial production had climbed a third above its pre-war level. Berlin transformed into the cultural capital of Europe, a whirlwind of expressionist film, avant-garde art, and cabaret culture, with the Bauhaus movement rewriting the rules of architecture and design. From the outside, Weimar Germany looked like it had turned the corner. But underneath the glittering surface, the foundation was hollow. And this is the piece the popular narrative almost always leaves out. Germany's recovery wasn't built on genuine internal strength. It was built entirely on borrowed money, concentrated overwhelmingly in short-term American loans. American banks lent to Germany. Germany used that money to rebuild industry and pay reparations to France and Britain. France and Britain used those payments to service their own war debts back to the United States. The money moved in a closed circle that depended entirely on one variable: whether American lenders kept the loans flowing. Some economic historians argue this wasn't a genuine recovery, but a financial scaffold engineered to keep the broader European system from crumbling, functioning only as long as conditions in America stayed favorable. The German economy was sitting on a trap door, and the lever controlling it sat in New York. Meanwhile, the political stability of this golden era was itself something of an illusion. Between 1919 and 1933, Germany cycled through roughly 20 different cabinets, and no single coalition held power for more than about 2 years. Proportional representation guaranteed a fractured parliament packed with dozens of competing parties, none ever close to a majority, producing weak, compromise-driven governments incapable of decisive action. Out in the countryside, the golden years never really arrived. Farmers made up roughly a third of the population and were drowning in debt, with rural incomes lagging far behind national averages and agricultural output still below pre-war levels. By 1928, small rural uprisings were breaking out across the north, and it's no accident that the Nazi Party's earliest electoral gains came precisely in these agricultural regions, where messaging about betrayal by bankers and financiers found a receptive audience. Even during these supposedly good years, unemployment never fell below well over 1 million people, and beneath the surface, prosperity, deep resentments simmered. The old middle class, shopkeepers, clerks, small business owners, never fully recovered from the hyperinflation and watched new wealth flow disproportionately toward industrialists and financiers. Many conservative Germans looked at the cultural liberalism blooming in Weimar Berlin not as progress, but as decay, a symptom of everything that had gone wrong since the monarchy fell. Then the trapdoor opened. In late October of 1929, the Wall Street crash sent shockwaves straight through the German economy almost instantly. Panicked American investors began calling in their loans. Foreign capital dried up overnight, and banks that had been propping up German industry suddenly had nothing left to lend. Businesses failed by the hundreds. One of the country's largest insurance firms collapsed by early 1930. Unemployment, which had sat around 1 million a few months earlier, exploded past 3 million within a year, and by the winter of 1932, it had climbed past 6 million, nearly a third of the working population. Industrial output collapsed to barely half its 1928 levels. Foreign trade shrank by roughly 2/3 within 3 years. And the United States, once Germany's largest export customer, slammed the door shut with new protective tariffs. Now here is where Weimar's story diverges most sharply from the popular telling, because the Depression on its own did not deliver Hitler to power. It created the conditions, the desperation, the fury, the appetite for radical solutions, but the actual mechanics of the Republic's death came down to a specific sequence of deliberate political decisions made by a small circle of men. In March of 1930, Chancellor Hermann Müller's coalition government collapsed over what sounds, on its face, like an almost trivial dispute about unemployment insurance contributions. That argument turned out to be the hinge on which everything else swung. Instead of another parliamentary coalition, something without real precedent took its place: a presidential cabinet. Hindenburg, the very man who had helped construct the stab-in-the-back myth over a decade earlier, appointed Heinrich Brüning as chancellor. Brüning had no parliamentary majority and made no serious effort to build one. Instead, he governed through Article 48 of the Constitution, the Emergency Powers Clause, meant to let the president issue decrees without parliamentary approval during genuine crises. Article 48 was a safety valve for short-term emergencies. Friedrich Ebert, the Republic's first president, had invoked it fairly often, but generally against real threats to public order. What Brüning did was different in kind. He used it to bypass the Reichstag as routine governance, not exceptional crisis management. When Parliament voted in July of 1930 to overturn his emergency decrees, Brüning didn't negotiate. He asked Hindenburg to dissolve the Reichstag and call fresh elections. A catastrophic miscalculation and one of the most underappreciated turning points in modern political history. The September 1930 election saw the Nazi Party surge from 12 seats to over 100, transforming Hitler's movement overnight from a fringe curiosity into the second largest political force in the country. Brüning's economic policy proved just as damaging as his political miscalculations. Rather than boosting government spending to counter the collapse, he chose austerity, cutting expenditures, slashing wages, reducing unemployment benefits at the exact moment millions depended on them most, and raising taxes. He earned the nickname the Hunger Chancellor, and earned it honestly. Historians still debate his reasoning. Some argue he deliberately worsened conditions to force the Allies into scrapping reparations altogether. Others believe he genuinely feared a repeat of 1923. Either way, the outcome was identical. His policies deepened the crisis. With every benefit cut and tax hike, more Germans drifted toward the political extremes. And here's the detail most people overlook. Parliamentary democracy in Germany didn't die the moment Hitler became chancellor in January of 1933. It died years earlier, in 1930, the moment Brüning began ruling by decree as standard practice, the moment the basic democratic principle that governments must command a parliamentary majority was quietly discarded. From 1930 onward, Germany was governed not by its elected legislature, but by whoever could win the favor of one aging, increasingly manageable man, President Hindenburg. The Republic was already an empty shell by the time Hitler arrived. He didn't tear down Weimar's democracy. He simply moved into a structure already gutted from within. After Hindenburg dismissed Brüning in May of 1932, matters deteriorated further. Franz von Papen was installed as chancellor, so devoid of political backing that contemporaries joked he was the chancellor without a single friend in parliament. He too governed through emergency decree, and in July of 1932 used those powers to depose Prussia's democratically elected government, Germany's largest state and the last real bulwark against the far right. The Social Democrats, who had controlled Prussia's police and civil service, didn't resist. They filed a legal challenge and waited for the courts to weigh in. Then came the final act. By late 1932, the conservative establishment around Hindenburg, men like Papen and the political general Kurt von Schleicher, convinced themselves Hitler could be managed, that his populist energy could be harnessed to crush the left and reined in from behind closed doors. Papen reportedly told associates they had essentially hired Hitler, and that within months he'd be boxed into a corner. They imagined that by surrounding him with conservative ministers and keeping the most powerful portfolios in their own hands, they could control him. It was perhaps the single most catastrophic miscalculation in modern political history. Germany's conservative elite, the aristocrats, industrialists, and military leadership had spent over a decade quietly undermining their own republic. They had tolerated the stab-in-the-back myth because it served their interests, welcomed Brüning's presidential rule because it sidelined the socialists, and backed Papen's takeover of Prussia because it crushed the left. Now they were preparing to hand the entire machinery of the state to a man whose contempt for their class was matched only by his talent for exploiting it. On the 30th of January, 1933, Hindenburg appointed Hitler chancellor. Within weeks, the Reichstag fire gave the Nazis their pretext to suspend civil liberties under the same Article 48 already stretched far beyond its purpose. The Enabling Act followed in March, granting Hitler dictatorial authority. Every party, except the Social Democrats, voted in favor. The communists had already been banned outright, and democracy, in effect, voted itself out of existence. So, when people ask what the standard history of Weimar gets wrong, the answer isn't that the facts are inaccurate. Most are well documented. What gets distorted is the framework connecting them. The popular version treats the collapse as a straight line running from Versailles directly to Hitler, an inevitable slide driven purely by treaty humiliation and economic catastrophe. The real story is messier and more uncomfortable, because the actual lesson of Weimar isn't that harsh. Treaties inevitably produce authoritarian outcomes. The real lesson is that democracies rarely collapse purely from outside pressure. They collapse from within when the people responsible for defending democratic institutions decide those institutions no longer serve their interests. The military leaders who manufactured the stab-in-the-back myth made a choice. The central bank officials who kept the presses running made a choice. The American financiers who built a system of total economic dependency made a choice. Bruning, choosing austerity over stimulus, made a choice. Hindenburg, choosing decree over parliamentary governance, made a choice. And the conservative elite who handed power to Hitler, believing they could control him, made arguably the worst choice of all. None of these were preordained, and none were guaranteed by Versailles. Each could have gone differently, and had even a few turned out otherwise, the 20th century might look completely different today. What makes Weimar's story important now isn't some neat parallel to any single modern political moment. It's the underlying pattern, how quickly democratic norms erode once those in power decide winning matters more than the rules. How wiping out a middle class's savings can plant a political time bomb that takes a decade to detonate. And how the most dangerous moment for any democracy isn't when extremists storm the gates from outside. It's when the people already holding the keys quietly decide to open them. The Weimar Republic didn't fail because Germany was somehow unfit for democratic government. It didn't fail because Versailles made collapse unavoidable, or because hyperinflation was an unavoidable consequence of losing a war. It failed because, at every critical juncture, the people with the power to save it chose something else instead, their own interests. Their own class loyalties, their own ambitions, over the survival of the system they had sworn to protect. By the time most of them recognized the mistake, it was already far too late to undo. That is the real origin of Weimar Germany's collapse. Not a single treaty, not one economic chart, not a lone charismatic demagogue, but a long chain of human decisions, each making the next slightly more likely, each narrowing the range of futures still available until the only future left standing was the darkest one imaginable. That is a story worth understanding, not because it belongs to the past, but because it has never really stopped being relevant. If this reframing changed how you see Weimar's collapse, hit like and subscribe for more deep dives that go beyond the textbook version of history, the stories that reveal what actually happened and why it still matters. See you in the next one.